African cinema. Boukary, thank you so much for your time. Great to be speaking to you. Now, you teach African cinema. What are the three most important things that you teach your students about the world of African cinema?
The three most important things that I teach my students, the first one is a film as a means or a tool for political and cultural liberation. And that by showcasing how African cinema has contributed to the liberation struggle of countries in Africa fighting for political independence in the 1960s through the 80s. In that sense, film is a critical element of political liberation. And also, in the subsequent years of nation-building efforts, because once African countries gain their independence, now you are in the nation-building efforts, which means how do you pull together linguistic and ethnic communities in a nation framework? And film has been an instrument in achieving that. So, which is kind of feeds into the larger conversation of what's the function of film or cinema, which some people talk about escapism, militancy, or entertainment. But the inception of African cinema should be placed in that context of militancy and fighting to gain independence and also to give dignity to African people. That's the first thing. The second for me is really the importance of representation. To see oneself on the screen, to see one story being told from one's perspective is very critical in constructing one's identity, but also to be able to confidently engage with the world. And film has allowed that for Africa, obviously after the end of colonialism, where they've gone through erasure of history, erasure of identity. And the third most important thing that I teach my students is the sweeping structural changes that is really going through the landscape of African cinema today. The first one is simply what I call the intervention of media giant in African cinema. We have a case most known for the case of Netflix, which started as a platform that acquire simply African titles, but now it has moved into producing content in Africa. And I'm thinking of the first two Netflix African original series, Queen Sono and Blood and Water, which came out early last year. And so you have that challenge. And the second sweeping change is we have more and more accessibility of content through the rise of TV series, because this has not been the case. Because up to the end of the 1990s, TV series in Africa was consumed mostly in foreign TV series. But starting from the early 2000s, we have the rise in the production and circulation of TV series. And the third, in terms of sweeping changes, is how video and digital technologies has really revolutionized production and distribution on the continent. Because in the prior years, I'm thinking about before 2000, you have to go to film school mostly in Europe, in the West, to make films, but not now anymore because you have accessible equipment. And in terms of distribution, used to be the festival circuit. That is really the main, distribution network. But now we have more venues to show.
Give us an idea of who you're teaching. Who's interested in learning about African cinema these days?
In my African cinema classes, those are mostly minorities, when I say minorities, and I have a lot of African students in my class. And those are sometimes first generation immigrant or second generation immigrants. And I also have many African American students in my class, because I remember last year in a very, I would say, hard, melts my heart when I received an email from a student who said, thank you so much, Professor, for exposing me to film from the continent. And my mom also sent you her best regard, because all throughout, the semester, I didn't know that, her mom was also, following the class, watching the movie, and, everything. So it's, that's one of, I don't know, bonus of teaching online. You don't know who is on the other end. Yes.
Now, of course, a lot has changed in the landscape of African film. A lot has changed on the continent. A lot has changed in the world. What are the trends that you're seeing about the kind of stories and subjects that African filmmakers are tackling right now?
Right now, what we're tackling are mostly what I call transnational issues. The first one that comes to my mind is migration. And I'm thinking of a film, Atlantics, by Mati Diop, 2019. And also, I'm thinking of extremist violence, which is also fits in the category of transnational issues. And we have Timbuktu by Abdurrahman Sissako from Mauritania. But in addition to transnational, maybe I should say, to contextualize the transnational issues, we have to think about it against the backdrop of how far African filmmakers have come, because most African filmmakers from the 60s to the early 90s, most used to live on the continent, produce on the continent, and it's only maybe distribution that they go abroad. But starting with 2000, we see the international space has become not only space of work or residence, and sometimes we see filmmakers, living in one place and working in another. So it really, fits with that, larger framework. Another theme that I see really, coming up is, it's not coming up, it's already present. I would say a continued thematic treatment of gender, women issue, and sexuality. And on that note, I'm thinking of Rafiki, by Wanuru Kayiu from Kenya. That's my students love watching. Also, I'm thinking about recently last year I screened Sofia. It's a Moroccan film about abortion, how difficult it is or illegal to get abortion in Morocco. And that's why I'm saying it's a kind of continuation of what has been already on the ground, but really now it's getting more visibility, because for certain films on some topics that may be seen controversial, which would never have seen the light of the day, but now they have. But in addition to that, transnational issues plus gender, women, and sexuality, there is a more and more like a kind of eclectic selection of topics that is coming up through what I call genre cinema, which is comedies, thriller, action. And for that, I'm thinking mostly of Nollywood. How it's very difficult to put one theme on Nollywood, movies. So I think it's to sum up, I would say there is innovation but continuity in terms of thematic treatment.
And of course, African filmmakers are everywhere in the world. But do you see a difference between the kind of stories told by filmmakers on the continent and those in the diaspora?
I would say the differences are simply that each entity, Africa and the diaspora, each tell a story that are consistent or set in their own cultural and historical references, or simply that are rooted in their own experience. So in that sense, it's a little bit different. But we've seen with so many examples that we have crossover in terms of the treatment of history and also the shared blackness in global cities. And I will give a specific example. We have last year, Coming to America 2, which is, could definitely make that, a crossover. And also we have a Black Panther, which really links the two. And I would say last year also, that was in the tower of last year, 2020, you have the release of Enslaved, which is the TV series by Samuel L. Jackson, which talks about over 400 years of slavery, the history. You have the release of the HBO series, which are directed by the Asian Raoul Peck, Exterminate All the Brutes. So we see, although African cinema or cinema of the diaspora are kind of in a silo, expressing and bringing to the fore the experience and realities of each entity, we see a lot of crossover and in terms of thematic treatment. But also we have the work of some producers who are producing African content. Here I'm thinking of Danny Glover, who could produce a lot of African content, and also Forrest Whitaker, who's are active in producing African content. So we may sometimes be in different silos or feel we are in different silos, but a lot of ways where we are cross-pollinating, each other in terms of imagination and cultural productions.
Earlier in the show, we were talking about the race between streaming giants for dominance in Africa. In your view, is it more important to get African films seen by a global audience or to get African audiences seeing content produced by African filmmakers?
I would say both, but in reverse order. I would say it's critically important for Africans to see African content. Why? Because traditionally, African cinema has not always been accessible, available to African audiences, because films were made and they went through overseas festival circuits, and sometimes it's only through press that the everyday people hear about it but never get to see it. And that was later coupled with I would say the direct consequences of structural adjustment programs by the IMF, which kind of destroy the cultural industry in most African countries with the closure of movie theaters. So you put the two together. For decades, many Africans, I will say, the large majority of Africans, didn't have access or didn't see their own movies. So for me, it's important for Africans to be able to see their own movies because, as I said earlier, in terms of even the power to see oneself on screen, there's no words to put onto that power and to engage with it and to be able to keep your head high, walk confidently, and think highly of yourself. That is a lot, that feeds a lot into your confidence to engage with the world. So for me, definitely first, African be able to see their own films. But here is the caveat with, streaming. Because you have what I call prerequisite, infrastructural prerequisite. In order for streaming to happen, you need a reliable power grid, which is very challenging in most African countries. And you need also a stable internet connection, and that also is not given. And third, you need unaffordable internet services. You may have a power grid, may have the internet connection, but is it affordable on people's budgets? So on that sense, say yes, there is that possibility, but we may run the risk of cinema just being an experience of urban dwellers.
And we'll bring you more from my conversation with Boukary Sawadogo after the break. Also, a conversation with the woman behind the unconventional love story between Nollywood and Bollywood. Azuma Kompayore speaks to the movie producer and director of Namaste Wahala. We'll be right back.
Health, wellness, sport, beauty, medical breakthroughs. Healthy Living cares about your well-being. What are the main health concerns in Africa and around the world? Find out the latest on coronavirus. Connect with our experts and ask them questions.
How long does the virus stay?
Join me, Linor Moudou, in Washington every week on Healthy Living, right here on VOA.
You're with Straight Talk Africa. Welcome back. We're talking about the future of African cinema. Here now is more from my conversation with filmmaker and African cinema expert Boukary Sawadogo.
I think I did an interview, on a different channel about Black is King by Beyonce. I know when it came out, last year, but when viral discussion on different platforms, the representation of Africa, Africa through kings and queens, as if it's something that is set in stone, for centuries. But you have a new, I don't want to say new Africa, but, you have a contemporary Africa that viewers want to see or need to see. So I would say, today, if I look at some of the recently successful, films, be it critical, that had critical acclaim or commercial, success, I think those are films that are simply resonate with people on a deeper level and usually simply, everyday, people, everyday stories. And if you take Atlantics, it's not about kings or queens or royalties. It's just about trying to the passage of adolescence to adulthood, or trying to move to a different space to make a better life for yourself. And those kind of universal stories that resonate with people. So I would say, if for Africans, I would say just have a story that is compelling and that's really, can speak to people at the gut level. You don't need, to look into the sphere of royalties really to be successful. Yeah, if we talk about the diaspora, I'm talking about African American, cinema. So yeah, I understand the need to really address the trauma, in terms of post-slavery, but across the Atlantic, in Africa, those themes are starting to get a little bit, I don't want to say worn out. When I say worn out, I might be misunderstood that I kind of devalue the work and the need to process what has happened. I'm just saying that kind of repetitive themes that at one point people start to tune out. The same thing for Africa, the themes that are people starting now to tune out, which is I don't want to say anything, but almost anything that is related to colonialism. People's like, okay, we talked about it. We know the legacy still stays with us, but we just want to move on, to something else. I would say for young people, it's kind of more like generational, because for my generation and even younger, who born decades after the end of colonialism, after countries getting independent, there's certain things that we want to move away from. And it doesn't mean that colonialism, its legacy is not present. It doesn't mean that it's not something that we kind of just don't want to talk about it. It's simply that at one point we want to talk about our everyday life. We want to because we are in a so globalized world that we see instantly what is happening around the world, be it in terms of fashion, being in terms of music, and being in terms of creative. And we want to be part of that conversation, but also not be feeling that we are being held to the past and not being able to move forward.
And for filmmakers themselves, especially those on the continent, in terms of producing and distributing their work, do you think the environment has become harder, or has it become easier for them to do their work and to actually make a living doing film?
I think that it's kind of both. It became easier and harder, or I would say easier and relatively still hard. And I would take the example of production. In terms of production, the task has been relatively easier with video and digital technology. It's relatively easier, and also coupled with the fact that now you have more film school open up on the continent. So in terms of talent, in terms of technical staff, you don't need always to go to the West. It's already present, and they know the terrain, they know the environment, they can work effectively on a project and deliver it. So on that sense, I would say relatively easy, in terms of the production. In terms of distribution, it's also relatively easier because the digital technologies kind of democratize the access to platforms and also to multiple screens. So it's relatively easier. But what is still a relatively harder is funding, because so far we are still in search of the best economic model that will allow the emergence and thriving of sustainable film industries. And that is still difficult because in some quarters, in some parts of Africa, the economic model or the funding model is still heavily reliable on soft money. So which means that when that dries up, it's very difficult to get an alternative, source of funding. But that I should say that we have creative ways that are coming up, that talent are showing, which is crowdfunding, and also trying to get the private sector to be interested in funding cinema. So that's the challenge. And another one which is related to distribution is it's true we have Netflix. It's true that we have local TV stations. We have transnational TV stations. I'm thinking of China Star Times or India, ZTV. It's true that we have more interest in African cinema, but so far that hasn't generated enough income or stream of income for the filmmakers to be able to go from one production to the next without really delaying or spending a lot of years to find more sources of funding.
This conversation makes me think about what it was several years ago that I was on assignment in Harare in Zimbabwe, and I was in my hotel room, turned on the television, and I found a lot of Chinese content. A lot of TV shows were in Mandarin, of course. And, I'm sure a lot has changed since then, but now you can turn on the television in some African countries and get a wide range of international content. And I mean, beyond the British, French, and American variety, you'll see, like I said, Chinese content, Turkish content, Indian films and TV shows. And I often wonder whether this is a two-way street. Are viewers in those countries consuming or exposed to as much of Africa's content?
It's not the relationship here is in balance, in the sense that we see more interest, corporate interest in African media landscape, in African cinema landscape, than the other way around, which is if you have opportunity to see African content overseas, could be it in India or China, it will be simply on streaming platform or through an enclave of an immigrant enclave or diaspora there. But to see channels broadcasting it, that's, I have yet to see it or heard, hear about it. So it's an imbalance.
We were talking earlier about an enabling environment. If you ever had the opportunity, what would you say, what would your advice be to governments and policymakers across Africa about why they should invest in the film business in their country? What is in it for them and for the people of their country?
Yes, I think, maybe I will ruffle some feathers here, but I will say, yes, because the need is, if you are to think in terms of, money, film can bring money, but also it's not always about money, it's about, self-esteem, because once, a person feel as a whole, that person will be a very productive unit, if we were to think in terms of a capitalistic, terms. And just, one example is I was discussing the same question with someone, I don't know, many months ago, and the person, rightly made an observation to me, which I say it makes sense. I said, how many prime ministers in Africa or chief of government can you really think of who are not economists? Very difficult. And that's kind of, dictates everything, how the whole government thinks about, different sectors. So if we think, just imagine the alternative scenario where, prime minister or chief of, executive is is not an economist. Probably the thinking is not always about, how much that this is going to bring. And I think that's, we have to factor that into the equation. And also, I think it's my knowledge, I believe that in the African Union, there's already an ongoing initiative about pushing for, an African film industry, a vibrant one. But I don't know all the details. But I know at least in West Africa, I can give specific example of governments that have already set up film fund. We have a case of Senegal, and the fund is named FOPICA. And we have Cote d'Ivoire, it's named Fonseca. You have Ghana, it's named Film Fund. So we have, I think this we have come, a long way, but we're going back to the drawing, table. Why am I saying that? Because initially, at the inception of African cinema, we have many countries that are really government that are pushing funding and distributing African cinema. And then we went through a phase where government kind of withdraw, because of liberalization. Now, some government are coming back, setting up legal and business framework for sustainable film industries, to emerge, because we realize that this actually, will be helpful on many levels. Because now I know the buzzword is youth employment on the continent, and for every avenue that can be opened up to employ youth, I think governments is going to look into that.
Now, Boukary, much has been written, produced, and discussed about the history of African cinema. What excites you the most about the future of African cinema?
Yeah, I'm really, very, hopeful, and I'm very optimistic. Looking at some, certain things that is already, happening. I would see first, take the case of Nollywood. I know Nollywood has its detractors, but what is clear is it shows how, with so limited resources, one can be creative, resourceful, and showcase talent. And this is exactly what Africa needs, because in terms of film is a very expensive endeavor. And money, we know that, on the continent, not many governments, put money on the table for filmmakers, and not the private sector also, fund cinema. So to be able really to create a model that is economically sustainable, that also have a global appeal, for me, I'm very hopeful, and optimistic that, other models will spring up, on how to be resilient and innovative with with so limited resources. That's one. Two is, I would say, TV series. Why am I coming to that? Because more and more, some people are talking about, should we talk about cinema or should we simply talk about media? Because, we see kind of, the lines are blurring and the boundaries are blurring. And this is where I see a lot of creativity, where you have local stories that are really being produced. And you have, in terms of reception, we have local audiences that are simply, infatuated with those stories. And for me, this is important because it gets production going, but also it gets local people to identify with those stories. And third for me is, I would say, the most critical point is how we see more and more female African, filmmakers. And that is really significant because I had teach a class, African cinema, gender and culture, where I address those issues. You see, we have women who make up 52% of African population, but yet in terms of the representation, I would say behind the camera as, directors or in front of cameras, actresses, we are far off the target. But we see, this young generation, and I can give names of Mati Diop, I can give names of Waniru Kahiu, I see many names in Nigeria. And that gives me hope that in terms of a balanced storytelling, we will see more balance. Because if we talk about structural imbalance between the West and Africa in terms of distribution, production, we will have also to see the imbalance within ourselves on the continent where women, don't have, much voice in filmmaking. But now we see those voices coming up and the matters. And to see that, I just give one example. I don't know why Mati Diop always comes to my mind, but to see, the first Black woman to gain the Grand Prix at Cannes Film Festival, for me, it's like, yes, this is long overdue.
All right, Boukary Sawadogo, filmmaker and African cinema expert, thank you so much for joining me from New York. I appreciate it.
And thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about African cinema. Always my pleasure.
Now, we also asked you on social media, do you think it is important for African governments to invest in the business of African cinema? Katakia